A baseball in those days cost $1.75, which doesn't sound like much, except for me, it was 7 weeks' allowance. And so we needed to keep that ball in play. We had converted an old cow pasture into our baseball field, and if you hit the ball deep to left center, it landed in a creek. And we would drop everything and race to see if we could find that ball. If it landed in a stream, we had no trouble finding it usually. But if it landed in the deep weeds on either side of the stream, we had great difficulty in finding it. And not finding it meant the end of baseball for at least that day. So it's not surprising that one hot summer Sunday afternoon, a friend and I decided that we were going to chop down those weeds and find all those lost baseballs. And so we got machetes out of his father's garage, and we went over to that creek and we started chopping those weeds, when his machete hit a rock and it cut his hand pretty badly. And so he went home and got patched up, and when he come back, he had kind of a somber look on his face, and I asked him, "How you doing?" And he said, in Sunday school this morning, the teacher told us that when we do something bad, God often punishes us by doing something bad back to us. Well, that was a really sobering thought. And so we had to sit down and think about that. I was happy to learn whatever lesson we needed to learn through his injury. And we thought about it for a while, and we realized that a couple weeks earlier, the word we used was snitched. But in fact, we had stolen a couple of balsa wood gliders from the local mom and pop store. And we figured that this must be the thing that God's angry with us about and the reason for which we were being punished. And so we went home and we got a couple of prayer books. We went to our secret clubhouse, lit a candle, and started reading the prayers from the book. After a while, we'd hoped we had prayed enough to reduce some of God's anger towards us. I know that I felt a little bit better, and I don't remember doing any stealing after that. And so maybe we had the experience of forgiveness, but did we really come away understanding forgiveness? Is forgiveness about trying to appease an angry God? Is injuring little boys with machetes the way that God works? This is the Easter season in the church calendar. Easter's not just the one Sunday, but it goes from Easter Sunday all the way to Pentecost, which will be the third Sunday in May this year. And the reason that it's a whole season in the life of the church is because during these days and weeks, Jesus made many, many appearances to his disciples, both the inner circle and to others of his followers. And we also recognize that in this period, the despondent, disillusioned, confused, heartbroken, fear-stricken, and scattered disciples would somehow muster the courage to become the first resurrection people and take the message of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ to all the known world. Somehow these fearful men would gain the courage and the strength and the ability to take the message to the whole world. And they would take biblical faith in a whole new direction. The last week of Jesus' life is probably the parts of the four Gospels that they have most in common. And so it's a little bit striking that the four Gospels do not have a single resurrection appearance in common. They're all different. And so it seems reasonable to conclude that each story must communicate something about post-resurrection life and post-resurrection faith. Now, it's interesting that even though Easter's a really several-week season, I could not remember ever hearing a sermon on the individual resurrection appearances, just the empty tomb. And so I went to Quincy and told him that. But I forgot, even after 26 years here at Westminster, that if you have an idea, you get a job. So here I am this Sunday and 2 weeks from now because I had this idea. But each week, Quincy and I are going to take a resurrection experience and see if we can find the resurrection faith embedded in each story. And so this morning, the story that we're looking at is Jesus having breakfast on the beach with his disciples. I always love this image. Maybe it's because I like the beach, but maybe it brings back lots of memories. Looking at that picture reminds me of the family retreats that we used to take to Saugatuck, where at night we would worship on the beach with a fire like that right near Lake Michigan, and what powerful experiences those were. But there's something warm and comforting about Jesus preparing breakfast for his disciples on the beach by the sea. It reminds me of the passage from Revelation that says, "Behold, I knock on the door of your heart, and if you open the door, I will come in and dine with you." For biblical people, eating together was an intimate act that you only did with the people you were closest to. And so there's something about this appearance that's about intimacy. It's about Jesus inviting the disciples to take the closeness that they had with the earthly Jesus and transfer it to the same closeness with the risen Christ. And as you listen to the story and you heard that Jesus preparing a breakfast of fresh bread and fresh fish, you might have been reminded of the feeding of the 5,000 the other time when he fed the crowd with fish and loaves. After Jesus fed the 5,000, they were ready to follow him anywhere, they thought. And I think here in this story that Jesus is asking for the same commitment, inviting them to follow him into the future. It's also about empowerment. These ordinary men and women, despondent, disillusioned, confused, heartbroken, fear-stricken, becoming empowered to have the courage to come out of their hiding places and spread the word of Christ. An image that comes to my mind that I think captures what happened to the disciples that day comes from a really old movie from the 1950s called Mr. Roberts. If you haven't seen the movie, it's a World War II movie, and Mr. Roberts is second in command of a cargo ship that's way behind the fighting, and his biggest desire is to get to the front and to serve in combat. And the ship's captain, who was played by James Cagney, is a real tyrannical, mean-spirited guy that treats the crew really poorly. And Mr. Roberts is played by Henry Fonda, is the only one that has courage to stand up to the captain and serve as a buffer between him and the men. Well, Mr. Roberts finally gets his wish, and he goes into combat, and he leaves behind the second in command, Ensign Pulver, who's played by Jack Lemmon. And in a word, Ensign Pulver is a weenie. He doesn't have the courage to face up to the captain like Mr. Roberts did, and so the men have no buffer between the mean-spirited captain and the crew. And so in a climactic scene, you see that the crew is completely demoralized. They're frustrated with Ensign Pulver for not having the courage to stand up for them when they get the news that Mr. Roberts has been killed in combat. And they're grief-stricken and they're shocked. But then the camera zeroes in on the Jack Lemmon character, Ensign Pulver, and you see this incredible transformation come over him. It's like the power starts at his toes and it comes all through his body. And he gets this determined look on his face, and all of a sudden he jumps up and he races up the stairs to the captain's quarter. He kicks in the door and he goes, "What's all this nonsense about no movie tonight?" And the movie ends with a frustrated James Cagney, who now sees the face of Mr. Roberts resurrected in the face of Ensign Pulver. Ordinary people that all of a sudden had the ability to do extraordinary things. Well, after breakfast, Jesus takes Peter aside, and the story takes on a more serious tone. You know that Peter was actually his nickname. His name was Simon, and he got the nickname Peter, which means the rock, because Jesus said, on this rock I will build my church. And in another place he said, I'm going to give Peter all the keys to the kingdom. And if you know stories about Peter, he's often confused. He often gets it wrong. He often makes promises he can't keep. And so you would think that the rock that the church is going to be built on is a little cracked. But he takes Peter aside and he asks him 3 times, do you love me? And all of a sudden the focus is on forgiveness. But what's really going on here? And how do people of the resurrection, how are we to understand forgiveness? So many years ago, my friend, Sunday school teacher, taught us that forgiveness was about trying to get an angry God to be less angry and to forgive us. And if you've done the Disciples Bible Study or the other Bible study that we did in the last year, you can see that there's lots of support for this viewpoint. A lot of the Old Testament people thought that it was a pattern, that the people made a covenant with God, the people violated the covenant, God slowly got angry, gave them lots of warnings, finally became so angry that he punished them severely, sometimes over many generations, and that eventually the punishment would lessen, the people would be repentant, God would allow them to return, and they would form a new covenant, and the cycle would start again over and over and over again. Was that really the way that God works? And I believe one of the things that's going on in here is that through Jesus Christ, God's trying to communicate that there is no angry God, that it's not about severe punishment. In fact, the pastor of 1 John, who was part of John's community, said, there is no fear in love because fear has to do with punishment, but rather perfect love casts all fear. God wasn't putting an end to the cycle. It wasn't like he got anger management training and was now different. It's that we got it wrong from the beginning. That God was never about anger and severe punishment. Sometimes we can get into that cycle ourselves in an individual way, constantly seeking forgiveness, wondering if we're okay. Before Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, he was a monk in a monastery. And he really struggled with whether God was angry with him, whether God loved him. And one day he got the idea that the way to make sure that God was not angry with him was to go to confession. And he was in the right place because he could go to confession to any of the brothers in the monastery. And it's good that there was a bunch of them because he started going to confession 30, 40, 50 times a day. It got to a while that the monks didn't want to have anything to do with him. When he came along, they tried to be part of the wall so he wouldn't see them. I mean, how much sinning can a person do in 20 minutes between confession? And if they were tired of him, you can kind of imagine how God felt. His heart was in the right place. He wanted to be in right relationship with God, but he didn't know how to go about it. And in a strange way, his religious pilgrimage, his spiritual journey had become self-centered. It was all about finding out, am I okay? His life changed when he came to understand that the gift of grace is that we're loved unconditionally. So Jesus asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? And 3 times Peter answers, yes, Lord, I love you. But to understand some of the depth of this dialogue, you need to know that the Greek has 4 words for love. And they're not synonyms. They all mean different facets of love. One is philios, which means brotherly love or the love of friendship. Another is agape, which the early church adopted to mean divine love, the self-sacrificial, all-accepting love of God. You need to understand that because when Jesus says first to Peter, "Do you love me?" he asks Peter, "Do you agape me? Do you love me in that divine way?" And Peter answers, "Yes, Lord, I love you, but in a philios way. I love you in a brotherly way." And a second time, Jesus says, "Peter, do you love me in a divine way?" And a second time, Peter says, "Yes, I love you, but in a brotherly way." And I picture at this point that Jesus is getting a little exasperated. And whatever he did, this or whatever, he's wondering if this guy's ever going to get it, I think. And so the third time, I picture Jesus taking a really deep breath and saying, "Okay, Peter, do you love me in a brotherly way?" And Peter's feelings are hurt, but he says, "Yes, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you in a brotherly way." So what's going on here? You might remember that on the last night of his life, Jesus predicted that the disciples would abandon him. Peter said that he absolutely wouldn't. But before the sun rose on Good Friday, he had denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And you can imagine how guilt-ridden, how ashamed, how confident Peter must have felt in the days after his denial of Christ. And so Jesus asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" because each one undoes one of the denials. And when the 3 are done, Peter is a forgiven individual. The rock of our church, the first person of the resurrection, is a forgiven individual. Now, Peter, for his part, answers in a philios way, I think, because he doesn't want to make another promise that he can't keep. So he tries a little cautious. He said, "I'm not ready for agape, but I love you in a brotherly way." So Jesus will have to keep working on him. Forgiveness, we discover, for resurrected people is not about punishment. It's not about making an angry God happier. It's about healing. It's about unloading burden that we carry. It's about reconciliation, reconnecting with the risen Christ. It's about getting on the right path. It's about clearing out the garbage so that we can focus our spiritual energy on the ministry that God has for us. A few years ago, I went on a 7-day retreat, and I went there thinking I was going to get an education in prayer forms, learn more about prayer. It actually turned out to be a powerful spiritual experience, and one of the things they had us do was to meditate on a picture of Jesus. And I was uncomfortable doing it at first, and then it began to stir a lot of things within me. I was sort of feeling like Martin Luther. I was looking at it and I was saying, I wonder if Jesus is pleased with me. I was getting the feeling that maybe Jesus was angry with me. Well, these were kind of unsettling feelings, so, sorry. I need bigger ears, I guess. So during a period of silence that we had on the retreat, I went back to the picture and I continued to pray with it. And I got the feeling that a message was coming through that God wanted me to confess. Well, confess what? And I thought about it, and I thought about how the last year had gone, and in the last year, I thought I got a really clear sense of where my call was taking me. It was maybe the greatest sense of clarity I thought that I ever had. But things didn't end up working out with that call, and I felt a lot of hurt and disappointment about it. Even felt that I had been betrayed to a certain degree. And so I came to discover that I had showed up at that retreat hurting. and I didn't even know it. I had a supervisor one time that said I had an amazing ability to ignore pain, my own pain, and he wasn't giving me a compliment. What he was saying was that I was so dumb that I didn't have the ability to recognize when I was in pain. Unfortunately, he was right. But as I reflected on that experience, I realized that I had some responsibility in the outcome as well. That over the period, my trust and clarity and faith in the process had wavered. I was sort of like Peter, who got out of the boat and walked those first 2 steps on the water, then realized what he was doing and started to sink. And so it wasn't all something that was done to me, but I also had a responsibility in it. So it was the last day of the retreat, and if I was going to do this, I needed to do it now. I got up at 5 or 5:30. I went out to this place in the park that I found right by the Patapsco River, and I prayed about this experience. And the strangest thing happened. As I was praying, I could almost physically feel this heavy load being lifted from my shoulders. And not just my part in it, but also the sadness and disappointment and so forth. And it's almost like I could see this giant load plopping into the Patapsco River and being taken away by the current. And then it hit rapids and it went around the bend. And suddenly I felt lighter than air. I ran the 2 miles back to the conference center, and I hadn't run in a long time. I was running partially because of how great I felt, and partially because I thought if I hurried, I might get there in time for breakfast. And as I was charging up the stairs to change my clothes, I ran into the head of the retreat, and she goes, you look healthy. And I said, yeah, I feel great. I don't see that experience as God being angry at me, and when I confessed, I put God in a better mood. I see God as inviting me to follow the path of healing. And so that this experience of forgiveness became about healing, about letting go of heavy burdens. It was about reconnecting with the risen Christ. It was about being free to put our love and passion into whatever it is that God has called us to do. Many years later, I can answer the question, I don't believe that God uses a machete to scare straight little boys. I don't believe that God uses scare tactics to help us to be the people we can be. But instead, that the resurrection faith is that when the time in our journey comes, when it's time for confession and time for forgiveness, that we go to the Lord in confidence that He's going to bring healing to our lives, that He's going to lift off our heavy burdens, that He's going to help us to reconnect with Him at a deeper level, and that He's going to free us to put our love and passion into whatever it is that God has called us to do. Amen.